Welcome back to Wilmington's Morning News. Great to have you alongside this morning. 910-763-4000 is our studio hotline. Well, as we head into get later into the year here in 2024, the big unknown, and it's always the case in presidential elections, is the independent voter. And we know how big of a story that is here in North Carolina. Our largest voting bloc in population is an unaffiliated voter base. Joining us on the program this morning, he is a political commentator over at Young Voices, also works over at the Consumer Choice Center, our friends from the Consumer Choice Center. Stephen Kent joins us on the airwaves this morning. Stephen, good morning to you. Hope all is well. What are you seeing with the independent vote as we head towards November?
Well, it just seems, Nick, like we see this story play out every single year. We hear a lot about the rise of the independent voter. There are more unaffiliated voters than any year prior, and it is true. It's absolutely true that particularly voters under 30 identify themselves as independent or unaffiliated with the Republican or Democratic brands in record numbers. I believe 45% for American adults right now versus about 36% 10 years ago. That number is always creeping upward, and it's a demonstration of the toxicity of those main party brands. But I got to tell you, I'm not sure I really believe in its significance in the way that I used to.
Tell us why.
Well, in politics, you've got this mass of lean R and lean D voters, the unaffiliated voters of the world, of which I am one. I used to be a Republican up until 2017, and I entered the world of being an independent. But look, I still lean hard R in most elections, and that tends to be the case with at least 70% of those registered unaffiliates. The thing that they are motivated by, more than they are driven by ideology, is that they know who they don't like. Your lean R's know that they don't like Democrats, and your lean D's know that they don't like Republicans. And so when they go to vote, they're looking for a candidate that doesn't match their expectations of the other side. And that's why you get candidates like Nikki Haley who do so well with these so-called independent voters, is they are, estranged Republicans or certain types of Democrats who want to see a Republican that doesn't match the boogeyman that they've always been told about,
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting way you put about it. I've coined this term over the last couple of years. I call them ping pong voters. And for folks that are, on the hard right side of the aisle or the hard left side of the aisle, they walk into a voting booth and it's RRRR or DDDD. But it's kind of hard to put yourself in the mindset that there are these voters that go down the ballot and, I'm going to vote for this Republican. I'm going to vote for this Republican, but I'm going to vote for this Democrat, or I'm going to vote for this Democrat here. This ping pong voter, it's a kind of a weird thing to put yourself into that mind space of if you're somebody that votes consistently straight shots a party on either side. But they do exist, right?
Oh, yeah, they absolutely exist. And I've talked a lot about this when I've gone out and spoken about youth politics, which is that you've got this rising tide of people who call themselves unaffiliated. But, just for a point of humor here that I think is a good connection, you also have a huge rising tide of young adults in this country who call themselves LGBTQ, even though that there is no real evidence that they live anything other than a heterosexual lifestyle. Gen Z adults, they used to consider themselves LGBT at 11% just 4 years ago. That number is now 22%. That is incredible. To me,
wow. One in four,
that's a culture. Yeah, that is a culture of people who just want to be mold breakers and want to say that they're independent in some way, but without any real stakes to that. And the point that I'm making here is that gays and lesbians and queers exist. There are some real independent voters, but we've got a lot of people who put on that mask but don't actually behave like independent voters. And I think that a lot of politicians sometimes get a little bit deceived by the idea that there's a lot of voters up for grabs.
I want to dive into that with you because I think that's interesting. So you're in your expertise and your experience, there is not really that many voters that are up for grab. There are plenty of hardcore Republicans, hardcore Democrats that, as you note, are calling themselves independent voters. Nothing is going to change their mind. Nothing is going to convince them they're going to vote straight R or straight D anyway.
I do think that. I mean, I've done a little bit of time working in the polling industry, and I'm nothing, akin to an expert in polling, but you do just have this very slender margin of about 20% of American voters who are actually movable. But again, it comes down to making sure that your brand as a candidate doesn't match up with the worst possible version of what the other side says you are. The trick for winning elections right now is for you to have moderate favorable numbers as a politician, moderate to low unfavorables, and then a lot of undecided voters who don't know anything about you. Ron DeSantis was actually one such person who had decent favorables, decent unfavorables, but then a lot of people who hadn't yet formed an opinion about him. The trick is to not be the boogeyman. This is crucial. Contrary to what some people will tell you, I think voters are very smart, and they respond to being lied to. They respond very badly to being lied to. And when Democrats call every Republican a Nazi, a hater of women, a racist, or an out-of-touch corporate shill, when you conduct yourself in a way that is nothing like any of that, people will go, Democrats are lying to me about this person. And your independents, your movable people are going to be more inclined to consider that person. And that is part of the appeal of someone like Nikki Haley. It was the appeal of John Kasich. And it even worked a little bit for Ron DeSantis because he didn't have a very well-established national brand.
We're joined this morning by Stephen Kent. He is over at Young Voices. He also does some media with our friends over at the Consumer Choice Center. So let's talk about that 20% of individuals that are movable. They're going to be up for grabs. And in all likelihood, we're going to see a rematch, Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. Stephen, I think everybody's formed an opinion one way or the other on those two individuals. What do both of them or what do either of them have to do to win over some of that 20% that you say is up for grabs?
Well, I think that we might be living in an era where the person who is campaigning and visible less is the person who is most likely to win over those skeptical individuals. Donald Trump and Joe Biden are both highly, highly disliked by certain parts of the electorate. Independent voters are not attracted to the very far left politics of Joe Biden and his geriatric nature. And they are also pretty repelled by the temperament and, unpredictability of Donald Trump. And when Donald Trump is out of the news, not giving speeches, not tweeting, people start to remember him more fondly than they might have when he was in office. Joe Biden, he has the same kind of strategy, and he leaned into it during COVID. It was the basement strategy. You hardly saw the guy. He barely did anything. And when you are not actually that visible and doing things that people might dislike, your favorables are going to go up. So I actually think that all of Donald Trump's legal problems are going to give him a little bit of an edge because he will not be out there stirring the pot in the way that he is used to. He's on TV being put through trials and looking something like a victim. And that is a more favorable Donald Trump than the one that we know.
It's pretty fascinating when you kind of break down what goes into some of these independent voters or some more of these ping pong voters as to what they latch onto and what they look for in these candidates. Let me ask you quickly about the issues before we let you go this morning. What do you think are some of the top issues that are going to be driving some of those people out and voting this cycle?
Well, you never know because something could happen tomorrow, but I certainly think that we are headed into a foreign policy election and an immigration election, which I think those two issues have become increasingly linked as we've seen the southern border fall apart and become a way station for migrants from all over the world, a lot of people on the terror watch list. So I think that chaos versus stability is going to be what this election is really about. And while Donald Trump might have made people feel like the country was unstable because he was constantly tweeting erratic things and saying things that people found to be alarming. It was a pretty calm international stage because everyone was afraid to act against the United States when Donald Trump was in the White House. That's just not the case with Joe Biden. And so the world has gotten increasingly more chaotic. And that's what this election is going to ultimately be about, is who can bring things back to a calm place.
Stephen Kent joins us here this morning. Stephen, what else do you do outside of doing some stuff with Young Voices and the friends over at the Consumer Choice Center?
Well, I'm a entertainment writer. That is my passion subject. So I actually am a columnist over at boundingintocomics.com, a really awesome entertainment site for news on what's going on in the world of Hollywood. A lot of the stuff that's going wrong in the world of Hollywood. And so I do columns over there focused on Disney and Star Wars, and that's a great joy.
Where do folks find that? Where can they track you down?
Yeah, you got to head over to boundingintocomics.com, and you can find me on Twitter talking about politics and Hollywood at Stephen Kent X.
Stephen, thank you so much for the time this morning. Great insight. Let's stay in touch and do it again soon.
Yeah, nice to get introduced and hear from you.
Appreciate your time this morning. Stephen Kent joining us as we talk about the ever-expanding, ever-growing group of individuals known as independents, unaffiliated voters, individuals that do not fall necessarily into a hardline party on one side of the political aisle.